What's up, Taiwan? I'm Louise with news from here in Taiwan and around the world. Demonstrators have marched through central Taipei to call for improvements to road safety, and they want all drivers to undergo regular checks. Demonstrators set off from Taiwan's legislature, calling for unfit drivers to be banned from the roads. Led by civic groups and supported by some smaller political parties, they want the government to bring in new evaluation systems for drivers. Their march comes in the wake of a crash where a 78-year-old driver hit a busy intersection in New Taipei City, killing 3 people and injuring 12. It's not clear if his age was a factor, but demonstrators are also calling for better checks on senior motorists and a regular license renewal system for all drivers.
这一次的那个游行的诉求就是会希望说，驾照在回训的时候有一些审核的机制，然后确定驾驶人他是真的有能力可以很安全的开车。
我过马路我会觉得有点不安心感，因为我不知道来的车会不会停让我。我只希望政府能好好阅读那个人本交通团体的请愿书，然后做一些驾训的制度改变。
Road safety has been a growing concern in Taiwan, which has been labelled a living hell for pedestrians. There's a lot of anger here among protesters over what they say is decades of failure by the government to reform the driver licensing system. Organisers are also calling for improvements to the design of Taiwan's roads.
我们的道路设计一直是以汽车为主，然后再来去规划汽车跟行人的道路，所以很多道路其实行人是完全没有路可以走的。那我们的骑楼其实也没有办法去做到全面的整平，所以我们很多人其实平常是要走在车阵之中，那包含是像推娃娃车的妈妈或是身障者，就会更加的危险。
The government says it's taking measures to improve safety, including a plan to raise fines for drivers who hit pedestrians. But these marchers want deeper change, hoping to prevent any more tragedies on the roads. Justin Wu and Louise for TaiwanPlus. The head of a Taiwan county government is speaking out against a planned referendum to reactivate a nuclear power plant. The country's last operating reactor in Pingtung County went offline earlier this month.
请尊重屏东人长期已经40年在核三的影响威胁之下，已经除役了，还要再走回头路吗？
The plant was shut down as part of the ruling party's nuclear-free homeland policy, but opposition parties want a public vote. The head of the Taiwan People's Party says he believes many Pingtung residents support restarting the plant. The fight over referendum proposals is just one of several clashes between Taiwan's legislature and the executive. They're held by different sides of the political aisle. For more on the split going on in government, Alec MacDonald spoke to Karis Templeman on our interview show Zoom In, Zoom Out.
Because of the reforms that Taiwan has gone under since democratization, I want to talk a little bit about the split between the executive yuan and the legislative yuan, and some of the more structural reasons that have given rise to this very partisan politicking right now.
The fundamental nature of Taiwan's constitutional framework now is it's basically a presidential regime, and that means there's separation of powers. That means that the executive and the legislative are elected by different constituencies, and they have what we call in political science separate survival. So they don't rely on the other side for confidence. And as a consequence of that, they both, I think, validly can claim a mandate from the voters to do what they see is the right thing to do for Taiwan. So Lai Ching-te can say, I beat both the TPP and the KMT candidate in the last election. Therefore, I have a mandate to lead the country. The voters chose me, not the other two parties. But the KMT and TPP can say the voters delivered us collectively a majority in the legislature. We have a mandate from the voters to do what we think is right for the country. So there's a kind of inherent tension to this constitutional system when you get a party winning the executive but not controlling a majority in the legislature. So if we get deeper into the problem here, typically for Taiwan, over at least for the last 16 years in Taiwan, the same party has controlled both branches. It's only when you've got divided government situation that you really see this kind of inherently adversarial relationship between the two branches emerge again. And then that puts a lot of pressure on the other parts of Taiwan's political system to adjudicate disputes between the two branches, in particular the Constitutional Court. And so the Constitutional Court has then become a political football in the partisan fight between the two other branches.
Do you think that this division will continue, or might there be a way found back to more normalcy in the current political environment?
I think the hope for all of us should be that there are some new norms that develop about what are kind of the appropriate limits to confrontation of the other branch. Let me sound a positive note here. When we look at the previous period of divided government in Taiwan, that was an unprecedented situation for everybody during the early Chen Shui-bian era. And in fact, there was some institutional innovation that occurred during that time. Both the major parties, both the DPP and KMT, agreed to significant constitutional reforms. In an ideal world, we'd see the two sides recognize that this current system has some significant flaws, especially when there's divided government.
So this is a good pivot point to go actually back to last May with the first investigative powers bill. Now, this was a bill that the KMT and TPP pushed forward through the Legislative Yuan, and eventually it was struck down as unconstitutional by the Constitutional Court. Can you go into a little bit about how that bill last May eventually leads into this constitutional crisis Taiwan is facing right now?
The legislature in Taiwan has always been at a disadvantage relative to the executive branch. They can call ministers to the legislature and put them on the stand and question them in public, but they don't have the ability to sanction ministers for saying things that aren't true. They don't have the ability either to subpoena other members of the government and force them to come before the legislature and testify under oath. And they don't have the power to acquire documents. And so there's actually a kind of a fundamental problem in the Taiwan system where the executive branch has much more power and information than the legislative branch. And so I think there's a valid concern by the majority in the legislature now that they want to strengthen legislative oversight powers. And this bill that passed in May was an attempt to do that. The problem is they passed it with just a KMT majority, and there wasn't much attempt to either negotiate with the DPP caucus or the executive branch itself. And they were a bit too ambitious. They pushed the limits of what was constitutionally allowed in this bill and opened themselves up then to a constitutional court challenge. My reading of the law, actually, and certainly the Constitutional Court, who's the real experts on this, agreed that big parts of that were sloppily written, or they were written in a way that violated some fundamental principles of the system. And so I think if you had a better crafted law, we'd be in a much better place right now.
For the full episode, search for Zoom in, Zoom Out on the TaiwanPlus website. Taiwan's central bank says the country's foreign exchange reserves hit a record high of $582 billion in April. That was up almost $5 billion compared to March. Taiwan has the fourth largest reserve among advanced economies. This historic high comes amid a surge in exports and a low inflation rate. Exports have soared thanks to delayed US tariffs and a fresh wave of orders driven by demand for semiconductor chips for artificial intelligence. It's more than a month and a half since US President Donald Trump announced a 90-day pause on tariffs that sparked trade tensions around the world. And manufacturers are still facing uncertainty, including Taiwanese bike makers, who rely heavily on the US market. Lauren Pattermore reports.
Carbon and alloy wheels. That's Jeff Chen's specialty. He leads Joy Group, a bike manufacturing company based in Taichung, building on the legacy of his grandfather, who started the business in the 70s. Chen makes tyres for high-end bikes that he sells to the US and Europe. His is one of 900 companies in Taiwan's multi-billion US dollar bike manufacturing industry. But US President Donald Trump's threat to impose a 32% tariff on imports from Taiwan, a move now delayed until July, has left the industry in limbo.
这个是一下子来的又急又猛，然后百分比又高。那我们当初也是都在等客户那边的反应是什么，因为特别是美国而已嘛。
Orders were dropped when the tariffs were announced on April 2, then surged a week later because of the pause, as customers realised they had a small window to avoid steep levies. Now, Taiwan's manufacturers are grappling to meet much higher demand. But as Washington and Taipei negotiate a trade deal, manufacturers like Chen are finding it hard to plan for the future.
这个部分太不明朗，大家没办法猜测。那有些人是说有可能高于10% 或者到30%，那可能三方面都要吸收某程度的百分比。
Taiwan's manufacturers have specialised in making components for final products, meaning anywhere producing bicycles rely on the country for parts.
我们在自行车产业，那我们扮演的角色是，比如汽车的引擎，所以我们做的是自行的驱动件。那驱动件有花鼓跟轮圈组两项是我们主要的项目。
Some analysts say even if Trump imposes tariffs on Taiwan, their market is still a better option than other competitors, like China.
The market is dominated by Taiwanese players. Who else can you source? Because let's say your competitor would be Chinese, say Chinese manufacturers in China, but they're having a higher tariff, and then also their technology and their production is not up to the kind of high-end bike required. So in this sense, the game is still by the Taiwanese manufacturers.
Trump hopes tariffs will encourage global manufacturers to move production to the United States. But that's an unlikely option for businesses like Chen's. Taiwanese bike company giant says replicating production there would be nearly impossible due to higher costs and labour challenges. For now, as Chen waits for Washington to decide how their goods will be taxed in the US, his only choice is to follow his grandfather, making bike parts to keep food on his family's table. Leon Lien and Lauren Padamore for TaiwanPlus.
A diving group off Orchid Island has come across a special surprise, an endangered whale shark. These giants of the sea were once overfished, so this shark's appearance was a rare treat. John Van Trieste reports.
The members of a diving expedition off of eastern Taiwan on Saturday were expecting fantastic views, but nothing quite as spectacular as what they ended up seeing. At 14 meters below the surface, not far from Orchid Island, a rare lumbering beast of the deep approached. The whale shark is among the world's largest fish, but years of overfishing have greatly reduced their numbers, leading to them receiving legal protections in Taiwan and around the world. The appearance of such an unusual creature was a big surprise.
它本来是要游走的，看到气泡它又再游回来啊，它又在靠近我们这边。然后因为它可能本身比较喜欢玩气泡吧，所以它本身它又靠过来。
Some marine life researchers say it's not a total surprise the whale shark showed up in that area at this time of year, when the water warms up and food is plentiful.
它出现的地方的话，应该是这个浮游动物它出现的一个地方，所以就是说它可能是摄食的这样的一个行为，所以可能最近就会常出现，就是说看到鲸鲨这样。
But they say the chances of seeing a whale shark are still relatively slim. So for the 10 or so minutes the 4-meter whale shark played in the bubbles from the divers' oxygen tanks, the group's members had a privileged spectacle indeed. Fu Huahong and John Van Trieste for TaiwanPlus.
Thank you for watching What's Up Taiwan. Finally, we take you to eastern Taiwan, where fields of daylilies are in bloom. I'm Louise Watts. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday.